right. Good afternoon, everybody. We are just letting some people trickle in here. We are live on Facebook, so if you can't see us on Zoom, you can always bounce over there. But yeah, so we'll be taking the next minute or two to let things kind of let people trickle in. So. All right, well, we can go ahead and get started here. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm with Mission Suite, and we are here for the community table discussion, part 2 of creating predictable revenue, how to consistently convert leads into paying clients. Again, I'm Ian Campbell, the CEO of Mission Suite, and joining me again today is Dean Isaacs, who's the founder and CEO of Vantage Group. Before we jump in, I want to address a couple of housekeeping items. As always, we're going to be taking questions throughout the session today, and we're going to be opening it up to Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature inside of Zoom to make sure that we can address them when they come up. This is the 4th in a series of discussions that Dean and I scheduled out to kind of dive in a little bit more from his experience. Last month we had our questions kind of plotted out and our conversation plotted out, but it went so well, and we ended up fielding so many questions here that we decided to schedule a second round to address some of the things that we didn't get to talk about last month. So I'm looking forward to jumping into this again. So moving forward here, Dean and I have actually decided to make this a monthly recurring thing between the two of us. He and I are going to be working on this together. We are going to be seeing basically kind of doing very similar things as we're doing now, just kind of moderated discussion format. But we're going to be bringing other business owners and business leaders into the panel with us so that they can ask questions directly and live. And so you can not only learn from our experience, but also learn from some of the things that that some of the other folks might be working on as well, and might be experiencing, so you can kind of get to know what they're doing and how you can learn from that too, and the answers that you want. So after this webinar, I'm going to be sending out a landing page, an email follow-up with a landing page, so if you're interested in joining us for a community table discussion, we will be able to you'll be able to fill out the form, and with that form will obviously have name, email, company, all those good things, but also kind of key topics in the sales and marketing realm that you want to be focusing on, and that you'd like to talk about as well. So we're looking forward to that. Our first time with a full panel here will be next month. So that's going to be an exciting one. So keep an eye on that. Dean and I are both very excited. All right, so Dean, just to kind of again introduce Dean here. He's a serial entrepreneur with over 20 years of hands-on business growth, sales, and marketing experience. He works with business-to-business companies across the U.S. They range from startups to Fortune 500 companies. His passion is helping small and mid-sized businesses achieve their growth goals by developing and implementing high-impact sales, marketing, and growth strategies. So again, I've been fortunate to know Dean for about 10 years now, and I've gotten to see some of his work with some of the clients that we've shared. And so, as always, we're looking forward to our conversation today. So Dean, for anyone who wasn't with us last month, or for the past few months rather, can you kind of dive in and just kind of expand on your experience a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I appreciate this, Ian. Thanks for inviting me along again. And I'm looking forward to the roundtable discussions in the coming months as well. So, as Ian said, I'm the founder of Vantage Group. We're a sales and marketing company. So we help businesses figure out how to generate revenue, predictable, profitable revenue. And so we work through everything from understanding their buyers and the buyer's journey to how we're going to market to those individuals, starting sales conversations, and then ultimately turning those conversations into revenue. So we cover a whole bunch of different things when it comes to strategy and tactics around revenue generation, really.
Excellent. Excellent. And so last month, again, we started this conversation around creating predictable revenue and turning leads into clients and whatnot, and those kind of meant to be the keystone on top at the end of this series of marketing into sales into conversion. But we dove really deep into things about how selling has changed over the course of the past 6 months in particular. Kind of the conversation and communication part of sales, and then a lot of our conversation landed around qualifying leads and knowing how to qualify leads, knowing when to walk away, things like that. Today, we're going to kind of just wrap up that part of the conversation here with by talking about objections, nurturing and following up, and actually closing deals, closing opportunities. So just kind of give our audience a little bit of a frame around the conversation. As you have questions around those things, obviously, definitely, like I said, drop them into the Q&A box of the Zoom session. So again, kind of continuing on that course and diving into objections. So we all get them, right? I mean, they happen all the time. They seem to be this kind of, when a lot of people first start getting into sales, they seem to be these kinds of big milestones and big boulders that you got to figure out how to leverage and move and whatnot. Can you kind of give us a sense around what objections really are and how we should be perceiving objections when we're actually having a sales-focused conversation with a prospect or a lead?
Yeah, for sure. So objections are a funny thing, right? So if you've ever been trained to sell, you're trained to overcome objections, right? Here's the process you use to overcome objections. Well, the truth is that objections are good. They're a good thing. So you ask, how should you perceive objections? They're a good thing. Usually, objections are the prospects needing more information. They need clarification or more information. So we sometimes in the selling role think of objections as this tough, horrible, bad thing, and it's a show that they're not really going to buy from us. Quite honestly, it could be a buying signal, right? And we just need to understand that. So, but I'll step back a little bit when it comes to objections. We talked about qualifying last time. We've talked a lot about the buyer's journey and our ideal client profile and all those things. And so really the truth is that if you're speaking to people that are qualified to buy your stuff, right? They have a need that you can help solve. You understand the outcomes and desires of what they're buying and why they're buying it. You understand where they're at in their buying process, right? Their buying journey. And you're aligned. You're having, two-way conversations. Then far fewer objections actually come up. But if you get into that sales pitch and you start spewing all of your cool stuff, talk about features and benefits, and you're going to get objections early on in the sales process, right? And so really what that is that's the prospect saying, hang on a minute, what's going on? I'm not there. You and I are not aligned. So let's assume that you are aligned with the prospect, right? And you've had a number of conversations. You really understand what their need is and you can provide value and all that kind of stuff. Then I think of objections in two buckets. The first is it an objection or is it a condition? And you have to quickly diagnose those. So a condition is something that you can't overcome. So I already have a CRM and it's my brother-in-law's company, right? You're not going to overcome that, right? Assuming that company's providing good value, I have to sit next to my brother-in-law, at the Thanksgiving table. You're not going to overcome that. You're just not. That's something that you have no control to change. So if you can quickly diagnose that it's an objection, something you can handle, you can deal with, you can get past, then you're in good shape. If it's a condition that just you cannot they have no money. Right now, we're hearing a lot of that, right? There's no budget. And it's not just a put off, it's the reality. They've laid off a bunch of people. They were able to get some PPP money and that's sort of keeping them afloat. And they're in that we talked last month about the three types of businesses, right? Survivors, the wait and seers, and the thrivers. If they're in survival mode, that's there's not much you can do about that. So that's a condition, and you have to accept that, and then you can establish what the next step in the relationship may be. If it's a financial thing and you have to wait until the next calendar year, then you can establish that. You can get mutual agreement that you'll follow up in January or whatever the time is, and then you do so. If it's the brother-in-law situation, yeah, maybe you check it in 6 months, see how it's going. So that's conditions. So if it's an objection, think of it as the prospect's desire to learn more. You probably haven't done a good enough job in perhaps qualifying. You perhaps haven't done a good enough job explaining the value that you bring or how you solve the problem. There's just some misalignment. And so what we tend to do is we try and script out the most common objections that we hear, right? So you hear one and you're like, all right, I'm ready for this one. I know how to respond to this. And bam, you give them the answer. So they throw up an objection and you hit it back. It's like playing tennis. They serve the ball and you hit it right back. Well, the truth is when you get into objection tennis, you're not really doing anything but continuing the confusion, delaying getting to the point where they have clarity. So if you've reframed the condition in your the objection in your mind that it's their desire to learn more, to understand more, the first thing you need to do is just ask questions about their objection. Usually the objection is like, well, I can't do this, I can't buy from you because of X, right? That X is something you need to just ask questions about. You know, what questions do you have about our features? What questions do you have about our timeline? And just dig in and really understand the sort of the meaning behind the objection. What are they trying to learn more about? So that was the first thing is don't respond, ask questions. So that definitely is the first step. I would say the other thing is don't get nervous, right? I think sometimes we get these objections, they kind of hit you, they can seem direct or abrupt. It's okay. Don't take it emotionally or personally. It's just their desire to learn more. So the first thing is to pause and then ask questions about that objection.
So, you bring up an interesting point that, as when you're going through sales training or, even if you've had a sales career in the past or even now, you're taught in such a way that objections are just another opportunity to close. Right. So handle the objection and then ask for the deal. Handle the objection, ask for the deal. And so what you're saying is that there's more to it that can, and from the sound of it, can really have a better impact on your working relationship with that contact or with that prospect moving forward.
Yeah. It's not an opportunity to close. It's an opportunity to learn more about the prospect and to be able to educate the prospect on the things that they have still some cloudiness about. I think, we'll get into closing, I think, in a little bit, but the right time to close is the right time to close. And it's the result of all the things you did before, right? It's not step 5 in a 5-step process. Selling is not that clean. So no, I think that could be the right time to close, but probably not, right? Probably not. Unless it's that final objection before they're ready to sign. I would say no. It's your opportunity to seek more information, learn more, get more connected with the buyer.
Yeah. Okay. So we all know that sometimes buyers aren't exactly willing to share objections, or rather be upfront about objections. Right. And there's a website called justsell.com. That I've gone to a lot, and they've got this concept of these 8 core objections, right? That all objections boil down to one of 8 things like lack of money, internal political issues, right? Things like that. And for anybody listening, definitely go check that out because it's a great resource in and of itself, just to kind of know what you're dealing with. But from your perspective, again, people aren't necessarily going to be upfront about, I don't have the money, right? I'm sorry, I just don't have the cash, or what have you, right? They're not going to want to say that. They're not going to want to talk about that. So how would you recommend? So like when you're working with sales teams or with business owners or whatnot, how do you recommend them actually rooting out those objections and getting down to what the objection really boils down to?
Yeah. So I think it starts with really doing a good job establishing rapport and trust with the prospect. Because if you're seen as just a salesperson trying to push something to get to a close, then they're never going to be honest, right? They're not, right? They're not willing to share. But we as salespeople sometimes spend too much time trying to establish rapport and don't spend enough time establishing our credibility and expertise. So if they see you as an expert in their industry, in their business, and in their problem, they're much more likely to share. And so that's part of the sales process is don't ask them. I mean, I think we touched on this before, you go into the office and you see the picture of the guy hunting on the wall. So you talk about hunting. People don't care about that, right? It's such artificial ways to establish rapport. The way to build trust and credibility is to be knowledgeable and be a resource. So if you've done that, the statistics absolutely show that they're more likely to share more intimate information about their business. So that's number one. I would say the second thing is it's okay to bring up objections. We're often taught, don't create your own objections in the sales process. I'm not saying create them. I'm talking about bring them up, be honest, be transparent. And so I'm working with a client right now. They're a software company and they're going through this whole repricing model, right? And they literally aren't able to provide pricing yet, which is kind of weird, but nonetheless, they're working with some of their providers and they're really close to having this new pricing structure. And so I've been on a bunch of discovery calls and demo calls with the reps. And so I've said to these prospects right up front, I realize you want two things. You want to see the product and you want to know the cost. And I said, we can do one of those two things today. And here's why we can't provide pricing. And I'm just transparent with them. And they're like, okay, that's fair. So again, establishing trust. So I think that's one of the keys here is it's okay to bring up what typically slows the sales process down and share that with a prospect. From our experience in working with construction companies, here's what we usually experience as we go through the process. And that immediately sort of disarms them. So then they feel like they can share, yeah, budget is kind of tight for us right now. Now you've got an opportunity to discuss that. Mm-hmm. Versus saying, what's the budget for this project?
Right.
That question never works.
Sure.
Because they're either going to give you a much higher number than they can actually spend, or they're going to lowball you. Mm-hmm. Either way, you don't have information you can use accurately.
Right. Yeah, okay, excellent. So as far as, you mentioned bringing up your own objections and whatnot. I mean, one of my favorite conversation points is, let me tell you why this is not going to work for you first. And then we can kind of move forward from there. But, not everybody is as blunt as I tend to enjoy being. So I guess my question for you is like, when should we be looking for them? When should we bring them up? Obviously, when they ask is certainly one way, but if you're bringing up your own objections, at what point during the conversation cycle should you be doing those? And how can you use that to actually show that credibility and show that expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if you've done some early discovery, I usually frame it up similar to what you just said, but a little different. For me, discovery is about finding fit. Am I a good fit for you? And are you a good fit for me? Right? So the next couple of conversations Ian, you and I are going to have is just going to figure out fit. And by doing that, it also establishes this more of a peer-to-peer relationship in the conversation. Whereas what we find is salespeople often establish this parent-child. They put the prospect on the pedestal, and now we're having to always sell up and ask for stuff. Mm-hmm. But if you establish this, is this a fit? Then it's a way to disarm. And you alluded to it. I want to disqualify early and get them out of the sales process. Mm-hmm. So the faster I disqualify, the more deals I close. Because I'm not spending time, effort, energy, money on the prospects that will just never close. So you establish that relationship, you establish credibility and fit. And I think you just selling is organic, right? It's an organic conversation. And so I think if you understand what these typical objections or mile markers, sometimes you can look at it as in the sales process are, bring them up. If they're not coming up, if price hasn't come up, if I haven't asked about your price and you've had a couple of conversations, let's say, I bring it up, right? I start to frame up sort of like a scope, a direction, a recommendation, and give them a sense of what it might cost, even if they're not asking. Mm-hmm. Because that immediately can flush out those that don't have budget.
Sure.
Right? Versus asking them what their budget is, oftentimes they either don't know, at least in my world, people typically don't budget a year ahead for some of the services I provide,
Right.
right? It's based on need and demand. And
Hmm.
so I have to help them figure out how to find resources and what the return on that will be. So I think you can use those questions and bring up those milestones throughout the conversation. So I don't wait. The last thing to do is flush out a hidden objection right at the point where you think you're going to close.
Yeah.
Like we've all had it, right? You get the proposal to them, they say it looks good, and then they tell you, I got to run it by such and such.
Yeah. All right.
I didn't know there was anybody else that you were going to, include in this decision. You
Right.
should have qualified that.
Right.
And if it's an objection, then you need to bring that person into the conversation as well. So flush them out early as you can and keep asking those questions along the way.
Yeah, and of course, I guess it's worth mentioning that it's the salesperson or the person doing the business development's job to find that to find out if there's, as Dan Levitt, a mutual connection of ours, says, Mary in accounting, right? There's always a Mary in accounting. It's your job to find that, right? It's not their job to tell you.
That's right. That's right. And so if you've done a good job of explaining also what it takes to buy your products and services, not just how we sell, because they don't care about how you sell. They care about how they need to buy. So if they've never bought services like yours before, they don't know what to tell you anyway.
Yeah.
So that's part of the salesperson's goal or responsibility, I should say, is explain what this journey is going to look like. There are a few steps along the way. Here's how it goes. And as we go through each of these things, who else should be involved? What else should we do? What other resources do you need? And so engage them in the process. And you're almost like sitting on the same side of the desk with the prospect and not selling across the desk to them.
Sure. You mentioned earlier the kind of the parent-child thing where the buyer's on the pedestal and, the salesperson is kind of always, nipping at the heels, trying to get something out of them. Is there a difference in that? And have you seen a difference in people who sell products versus people who sell services when it comes to that? Because if you're selling a service, obviously you've got to, like your personal service, then you have to get to that other side of the table with them anyway. So I'm wondering if there's more of a tendency to do that just by nature for someone selling services than there is for someone selling a product, for example.
I think there could be. Certainly, I think it depends on the nature of what the product is and who you're selling it to. If you're selling it to a purchaser, right, or a middle-level manager kind of person, that's a different sale to selling to maybe a more senior executive or a business owner. And if nothing else, ego gets involved. And so sometimes you have to let the buyer take control, or unless they perceive they take control.
Sure.
But really, you've got a much more strategic plan for that conversation, but you let them feel like they're running the show. So whether it's a product or a service, you can kind of leverage that tactic. But products often get commoditized, right? So I can sort of like put two products on the sheet and look at the features and benefits of each, and look at pricing and make a decision, right? There's very little sort of solution selling involved in many products. So in that case, then you kind of lose some control in the process. But if you can compare and contrast your product to your competitor's product, then all of a sudden you have a different sort of conversation. And that's where I would say to a prospect, you mentioned you're looking at X and comparing us to that. If you understand the key requirements for that product, for that prospect, you can sell against your competition, and you can disqualify the competition. So if there's a particular feature in a software package, for example, that the competitor doesn't have, and you can align their need to that feature, and you have that feature, you can disarm the competition really, really easily, right? It's almost like this one sentence dismiss. Ian, you said that one of the key features that you need for your solution is X. And, as we've discussed, competitor A doesn't do that. We talked about how so you can just quickly disarm them. So even though that's still a product sale, you're still not taking the parent child. You're really helping them see the solution from a
Sure.
much more strategic way. So you don't have to commoditize your product if it's based on features and price. There are still ways to get around that.
Sure. And to your point about that, that can happen with service-based businesses too, right? I mean,
Sure,
so
yeah.
you said that the key thing that you were looking for is XYZ. How do you go about uh, disqualifying your competition in such a way that doesn't come across as if you're bashing the competition, because that's not a good look for anybody, right?
No, it's not. It's not. Just you ask the question. So, Ian, you mentioned that you need to have this particular thing. How does you mentioned? I know you said you were looking at ABC. How do they do that?
Hmm.
Just ask them a question about it.
Right.
Certainly, you should know the answer to that question. Well, they don't. But you want to get the prospect to say that. You don't want to say, well, these guys suck because they don't do the things you need. Obviously, that's not going to work for you. So you
Right.
want to get the prospect to talk about the features and even ask them for their perspective on how they would compare you against the competition. So you
Yeah.
said you need these three things. How are you comparing us right now to these guys? How do we weigh up?
Right. Right. Yeah, and I mean, again, like you said, presumably your competition well enough to be able to, or at least the kind of key players in them, right? Because
Exactly. Yeah.
I imagine there's always going to be people that you don't know, but if you find out, how often do you, like, what, I guess, let me ask this, in what way do you recommend people ask the question of who else are you looking at? Because a lot of folks will say, well, I don't want to tell you because, they, for whatever reason, they're kind of, they're standoffish about that. Is there like and I know that we've talked about there's no secret questions or silver bullet questions. Is there like a way that you can, that you've found to ask that question that disarms people well enough to glean, oh, they're looking at whatever competitor A.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I find that those that aren't willing to share those kinds of things, you haven't built enough trust with them yet, right? Because what's the harm, right? You're going to go out and tell the world that these guys are comparing you to the competition. I mean, it's not like it's that secret of information. So I will ask, right? I'm just curious, and sometimes it's just even the way you phrase it. I'm just curious, who else you're looking at,
Mm-hmm.
and then I just shut up, just
Right.
pause for a couple of seconds, and then usually they will give me some information. If it's, well, I'm not going to tell you who. I'll say, I get it. I totally respect that. I'm just curious though, right? How are we comparing to the others that you are looking at? What are the things that you're looking for? How are you making a comparison?
Mm-hmm.
So then you can still get the information you really care about, which
Yeah.
is, are you winning, right? Are you ahead? Are you behind? Are
Right.
you missing something? And then not divulging the whom. So
Sure.
that's how I would approach that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I guess you're right. That you typically don't do that. Although I will say that when I had a client pick us over HubSpot, I went off and told everybody that I knew about it. So I mean, sometimes you just get excited and you can't help yourself, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Oh man. All right. Well, excellent. So let's move on to nurturing and follow up. So because oftentimes with these, the objections kind of come inside of that middle part of the kind of sales conversations and whatnot. Sometimes they come at the end and they just get dropped on you, and that's a different story. But I mean, when you're in that kind of center spot of the follow up process, or the center spot of the sales conversation or the series of conversations, how do you recommend just nurturing people and following up with people to stay in touch with them and not be annoying, not be but still not be the guy that's like, hey, I've got this piece of information that you can't find, and here you
Yeah,
go, because again, that turns into a pretty bad look.
yeah,
um,
for sure,
but
right.
actually, yeah, but actually follow up in such a way that makes them want to continue that conversation with you.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think that's the heart of selling, right? It's how do you maintain momentum in the sales process? Well, so I think first is having some empathy, right? Empathy is obviously understanding the other people's world, right? Their situation, their environment, what they're dealing with, and especially right now, empathy goes a long, long way,
Hmm.
right? We're all dealing with COVID at some level. Every person, every business is dealing with COVID at some level and the economic impact. So I would say empathy sometimes can help create patience. And we as salespeople, if you're on a monthly quota or a quarterly quota, you got to hit that number. The closer you get to that deadline, the more obnoxious you become, right? It's pretty transparent, right? The
Right.
prospect's like, okay, we're at the 23rd. Yeah, I know why he's calling me. So have some
For
empathy.
the 10th time in a row.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So the boss is calling you and you're calling me. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So have some empathy. And if you've done a good job in establishing credibility, building a relationship with the prospect, expertise, remember we talked about expertise versus trying to be liked, establish yourself as an expert. If you've done a good job of understanding how they buy, their buyer's journey, if you've done a good job explaining what it takes to buy your stuff, then you guys are on the same page, you're on the same map, same road, and you know where you're at in the process. And so for each step in the process, each step in the sales process, even if it's early on and you're still nurturing that relationship, there always has to be an agreed upon next step. That's the thing that I think is really important is you've got the buyer on the phone, the prospect on the phone, you've had a great conversation, and they've asked for more information, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you say, great, I'll send you an email with some links to websites, videos, collateral. Then I'll follow up with you in a week. Is that all right? What does the prospect say? Sure. And then you can't get them back on the phone, right? There's nothing worse than that. But you don't have an agreed upon next step. That I'll call you next week is not an agreed upon next step. That's lazy sales. So I would say, here are the three things that you've asked me to send to you. It usually creates some questions, a need for some additional information and conversation. So why don't we do this? Let's set a time now to get together in a week. I'll give you a week to look at the information. We'll get back together and we'll continue the conversation. There's a much higher likelihood if they agree to that appointment that they will actually be available at that time. Not 100%, but you've got a mutual agreement there, and there's a benefit to them to spend that next few minutes with you, right? They're going to have questions. They're going to want to know what the next step is. So I think that's really important, is all the way through the sales process, establish a clear next step. And there has to be value to the prospect to follow through. So there's this whole kind of concept of they want to know your scope and they want to see your price and then they're done with you, right? Generally speaking, hold some of that back, right? If you've established credibility and trust and they can see that you can help, don't give them everything at once, right? Give them a reason to get back with you. So one thing I won't do is just send a proposal.
Sure.
In the rare instances, I've already got a great relationship with a prospect. Maybe I've already done work with them before, and we've already talked about scope. We talked about price, and they're just like, just send me the paperwork, I'll sign it. That's maybe separate. But generally speaking, if they're a new client or a new prospect, I want to send them a proposal without a meeting on the calendar where we can go through it. So if they really want to see my scope and price, they have to give me 15 minutes in return.
Okay.
And very rarely do they not show up for that appointment. Some will say, keep just pushing on me to just send it. Just send it. I don't have time, just send it. So my question is, if you don't have 10 minutes to spend with me to go through the proposal, do you really have time to work with me? Mm-hmm. Right? Call them out. Disqualify them then. Don't spend any more time with them. So that nurturing process, or the steps in the sales process, has to be mutual value for both sides.
Sure. So we've all heard about this concept of it takes 12 touches to get somebody to move to the next step, or maybe it's 15 or 30 now. I'm not really sure, but it keeps getting longer, right, over the course of time. I remember when it was 6, but what sort of a process should we be instituting for? Because that gets into, those touch points get into more of nurturing than follow-up, right? I mean, because it seems to me that what you were describing is more of a direct follow-up. This is our next step in the process, and so let's schedule that now.
Yep.
So, as far as nurturing goes, should we be putting something into effect, or something into place where at each step of the sales cycle they get 12 emails after every 3 days or whatever for the next however long, kind of a deal?
Yeah, I think again, everything is situational, right? So when I think nurturing, I think top of funnel. early in the relationship, still in that lead development, kind of establishing credibility phase, you may not have even had a serious conversation with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've just sort of opted into something. They maybe send you an email. They're on your list. So that's kind of what I think about nurturing, right? Nurturing gets them to where they're a qualified lead, where you can have a sales conversation. So if they're in the nurturing phase, like I just described, 100%, you have to have a nurture campaign or a nurture process in place. We talked about 3 months ago the difference between demand generation and lead generation. Demand generation is kind of building brand and recognition and getting people to understand what you do. And then you get, when they raise their hand for a download, right? They sign up for a download or something like that. They've moved into the lead phase.
Mm-hmm.
That's really where a lot of nurturing takes place. So you have to have this journey built out that moves them through. They're in this discovery phase themselves, right? They're still figuring out, how do I solve this problem, right? Are you the company that helped me solve the problem? Do you have the credibility and expertise to do so? Do I trust you? That's what's going on in the buyer's head. So you have to have a sequence of emails or outreach that confirms and validates that, yeah, we're the people that you need to at least reach out to directly to talk about solutions. So having that nurturing campaign is really important. And of course, the beauty is, there are so many marketing automation tools, Mission Suites is one, obviously, that you can build that out and it goes. You don't have to do anything. And you can measure the response rate for a particular prospect to the different emails, let's say you send out. And if they're reading them all and they're downloading your stuff and they're clicking on the links, then they're sort of validating they're a more qualified lead. Then you can make the phone call, right? Send that personal email, connect with them on LinkedIn, whatever that next step is to engage in a sales conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So nurturing is, so it sounds like nurturing should be kind of split off from the actual sales process itself and really just focused on kind of towards the top of the funnel, when they're just getting into maybe considering having a sales conversation.
I think so, yeah. Because if you've engaged in a sales conversation, then the sort of the relationship has shifted a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
They know the basics of what you do, right? Because you've just educated them during the nurturing process, and now they're asking very specific questions about their problem, their situation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you may find is that the sales process stalls out. Maybe their world changes, their budget changes, whatever.
My next question, actually.
So what happens then is I have a second nurture campaign that's sort of like a re-nurture of a sales prospect, a little different to the ones that the sort of newer leads. It's a second campaign that maybe reinforces some things. Maybe it takes the detail of what you provide to a more granular level because they already know the high level stuff. So you can move them out of the sales funnel back into that re-nurture campaign and let that cycle run again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so how long for those deals, for those sales that have stalled or people that have just kind of gone into like duck and dodge mode, how long should we be how long should we continue the chase, right? I mean, because I feel like at some point you've got to kind of reclaim your time, so to speak, right? And say, okay, you know what, clearly I'm dumping you, you're not dumping me, right? Kind of a deal. So how long should we let that run until, not necessarily, send a breakup email, but, until we just kind of say, well, clearly you're not interested anymore. So let me, I'm here if you ever are, right? Like what's a time frame, kind of what's a good rule of thumb in developing that time frame?
I think it depends on your typical sales cycle, right? If you have a long sales cycle, 6 to 12 months, then it's just going to be a slower process, right? You're going to stay engaged with them for much longer. If you typically, I don't know, 6-week sales process or shorter, then you're not going to bug them for much, much longer. So I think you have to sort of weigh that based on the typical buy-in cycle. But I think the truth is that there's a reason they're not responding. Mm-hmm. And your goal is to try and understand that reason if you can. Either they're bought from somebody else and don't have the guts to tell you, or their situation has changed, or you're just not the right fit. And so what I do is I'll sometimes send that sort of, it's not quite the breakup email, but it's the pre-breakup email, which is what I call the I'm confused email. And so basically the way this works is, and I know some of the folks on the webinar today have heard me talk about this, so I won't belay the whole point, but the way this works is, and you can give me a voicemail. That can be really powerful in a voicemail too. You've said these things. You've said these things will have an impact on your business by this amount, let's say, and you wanted to get them done by X date. Well, that date's now passed, and I'm a little confused. Has something changed in the business that I'm not aware of?
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. So you're not asking for anything other than what has changed. And I got to tell you, that goofy email, that goofy voicemail gets more responses than anything else I've ever used when I get ghosted, because it's a very disarming email or voicemail. And you're just asking for some clarification, like kind of where we at. I'm a little confused. What's going on? I don't want to keep bugging you. And it gets responses. And I tell you, sometimes it's I am so sorry I didn't get back to you. It's been crazy here. I still want to have a conversation. Let's set up a time. Or you get the sort of cop-out email. Yeah, we've decided to go a different direction. That's just as good to me because I'm not spending any more time on it. So I'm confused. As long as you tie it back to what they had said as their deadline was, their expected ROI, because if it's, let's say, there's a tangible financial ROI. If we don't do this thing, we're going to continue losing $1 million a year. Mm-hmm. Well, it's been 6 months. So to me, that means that you've lost 500 grand by not making a decision. I'm a little confused. Has something changed?
Yeah.
Right. It's a little manipulative. I get it, but it gets responses, and that's the goal: is to get a response, kind of re-engage in the conversation if you can.
True. And messaging is everything with that, I guess, right?
It is.
So if you don't hear back from those folks, do you just kind of write them off and say, well, I guess, whatever?
I would then push it out a number of weeks or months, again, depending on your sales cycle. Give them one last sort of touch point, and then I would put them in my just regular outbound email campaign if I've got newsletters going out and white papers going out, and just get them back into that, just so we stay top of mind. And then if they unsubscribe from that, that's they broke up with you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Absolutely. Excellent. All right. So let's talk a little bit about closing. Obviously this is the kind of the end goal, right? One way or another. And even, and I think one of the things that we've talked about is that closing doesn't necessarily always mean winning, right? It just means coming to a conclusion. So I guess just from your perspective, again, thinking through, thinking from this, how should we be looking at closing a deal in order to kind of get out of our own way and actually make it happen?
Yeah. So closing, it's this funny thing that we say closing, we assume win, and it's clearly not always the case. It's getting the buyer to make a decision. That's really what it's about. So really selling is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a process, right? To close a deal is the result of all the other things you did before, all the conversations you had, all of the dialogue you had, and really selling is a bunch of small closes along the way. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure many people have heard that before. You're not closing to win the deal on day one. You're closing to just get confirmation that we're a good fit or a good mutual fit. That's a win. And you move to the next step. What's the next step in the buying process or the selling process? And if you have a clear sort of entry and exit criteria for each step in the sales process, each of those exits to the next step is a little close. It's a little win. And so you don't have to have the silver bullet closing question that I get asked for all the time. That's easy. It's like, when can we get started? And it's as simple as that. Well, they're asking you that usually, so they close themselves. So I think if you think about the sales process as a step, as a series of closes, there's a series of decisions that they make with you, then when you get to that final point, it's just a case of, is it a last couple of questions on a contract, final negotiation on price or timing? What do you have to give up a little on to get the deal done, depending on what you're doing, what your business is. And it's just a natural course of events. It's not this big, event you put on the calendar. Closing day today, right? When you buy a house, it's closing day.
All right.
It could be that, I guess, but it's all the things you did before that get you to the close. So that's how I think about closing. and I think the thing that slows down deals more than anything else, and we touched on this before, is poor follow-up, lack of follow-up, because that slows momentum in the process. And that's on us as salespeople to keep that momentum going. So if you've done a good job with that, then the process takes care of itself to a certain degree. There should never be, you should try and avoid any final hidden objections we talked about, or any final out of the blue questions, right? If you've done a good job throughout the process, all that stuff is handled. Case of, is it us? Is it somebody else? Or is it we're just not moving forward? And really, that third scenario should never come up, because you should disqualify them by then. You know they're going to buy. You know they've got time and budget. They've got authority to make the decision. And that's the question of just getting that final decision that's to be made.
So that ABC, always be closing, is accurate, just in a very different way than we've been taught, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, ABC, the old ABC is always be closing. It's always be asking for the business is really what that means. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
I've heard it. I've also heard it, close early and close often, and I don't even know what that means, but definitely heard. I've definitely heard salespeople go that route, and it sounds like that's. I mean,
yeah. If you want to tick off customers early and often, do that.
There you go. There you go. So, and I know we've kind of touched on this in a few different ways, but I'm curious, if you can just kind of pull it all together into one. What are some of the most common reasons that sales actually don't close? And it's obviously beyond just the cost of them, the cost of doing business.
Yeah, I would say first of all that's a good thing. I think we've probably touched on that enough. You don't want all deals to close.
Mm-hmm.
Some are not a good fit. Sometimes you wish for that deal, and when you get it, you realize it was not the right deal. Yeah. So have the desire to disqualify early, right? And if you disqualify more and early, more deals will close. So that's one of the reasons why deals don't close. It's not a fit. At some level, it's just not a fit. And if it's price or the services you offer, or even just a cultural kind of click,
right,
that can kill a deal, right? I've had clients tell me that they can't figure out why they're not getting deals closed. And when I kind of do a debrief, sort of a win-loss analysis, we realize there's just not a cultural fit with the organization they're selling to. And that's enough to get people to say, we're not going to do this.
Right.
So there's some very intangible things. I think that's one. I think the other is the buyer doesn't really fully understand how to buy. And I know we've talked about this a few times, but that can derail a deal more quickly than anything else. And it can get kind of hung in purgatory because they don't understand why you're asking for something or why you have to do this next step. And so they just disengage because they don't get it. So that's a really, really important one. Of course, I've talked about follow through a whole bunch of times, and that's one of the biggest ones. And I would say if you have the ability to not just send a quote or not just send a proposal, because usually that's one of the final steps before you close, don't send it. Set an appointment, set a 10-minute conversation with that prospect, email them the proposal right before you dial their phone number. And they'll say, well, I didn't get a chance to review it. Exactly. I want to go through it with you. Yeah, I want to go through it with you because usually there are questions that come up, and I want to make sure I answer all your questions so you have everything you need to make a good decision. And so that's one way to close more deals, believe it or not. And again, that if they're not willing to spend time with you that last 10 minutes, I question the validity of the deal anyway. So that's another one. Another reason why deals don't close, especially if you've got a flexible scope, maybe you're a services business, they think that the proposal you send, the scope and price you send is it. And they think it's kind of a take it or leave it. And many times it's not. And so one way to overcome that reason deals don't close is send it as a draft and say to them, you know what, based on what we talked about last week, here's what I took away from our conversation. Let's get together and talk about it. This isn't set in stone. This is a draft. I want to make sure it fits your needs. And of course, if we adjust the scope, price may adjust, could go up, could go down. And then you have a mutual conversation about that proposal versus they think they have to say yes or no.
Sure.
That's a huge one in professional services. If you've got a sort of a package or a price list, they're buying from that. and there is no wiggle room, that's okay. That,
Mm.
that is what it is. But if you have the ability to tweak and customize a little bit, having that conversation and letting them know this is a draft that has to align with your needs and our ability to deliver, it changes that closing conversation and you close more deals.
Yeah. So, you brought up the contact or prospects just disengaging from the process because they don't understand why you need this, or why the next step is that. And I don't know that we've actually touched on that before, or that I've necessarily asked this question, but I mean, but to that point, should we be at the very beginning of a sales process, laying out all the steps and explaining everything at the very beginning?
That can be overwhelming if you've got a complex and long sales process. I mean, if you're selling enterprise software to the Fortune 500, probably not. There's too many things, right? But if there's generally a flow to it, yeah, high level, you can just say, here's typically how we go about doing this. We have these kind of conversations, we share some information, we do this and this and this. So I think that generally gives them a roadmap of how this thing will go. But that's part of that mutual agreement for the next step, is to say, all right, Ian, we had a great conversation today. We did the demo. Looks like we might be a good fit, get their feedback on that. Here's what we'll do next. Here's the next step in the process. If you could send me your database so I can have a look at that. And then we'll get together in a week. And what I'll do with the database is I'll look at this thing and I'll be able to do this, this, and this, which is the why. And then we'll get back in a week and we'll continue. So I lay it out prior to each step to reinforce, and there has to be some value in it for the prospect to comply as well. Mm-hmm. So that's how I would address it, especially if you have a complex multi-step selling process.
Yeah, excellent. So next, the last couple of questions that I have around closing kind of go to tracking, right? Okay. And closing ratios, right? Because obviously we all want to know, what our closing ratio is, what percentages we're getting, all those different types of things, and obviously the last question that I have goes to increasing those percentages, and we've kind of touched on that, but just to, again, kind of give it a nice thing. But how should we be tracking our closing? Like, how should we be tracking these things? Because if a deal closes with a no at the very top of the funnel, should that impact the rest of it? Or should I wait until it gets to a certain point? When should I start tracking opportunities to have them impact my, kind of my closing rate, so I know what going into this, what I'm expecting?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think it's one of those where there's no excuse to not track pretty much everything, right? We've got technology in place that we can track everything from demand generation activities all the way through to the life cycle of the client, lifetime value of the client. So tracking is a huge important piece. What I find happens is when somebody hasn't been tracking information, tracking this stuff, it's overwhelming. So where do I start? Mm-hmm. And so what I'll have them do is take some of the most recent wins and deconstruct them. Let's work our way back through the process. What are those milestones that we had to get through to get to the win? Hopefully when you close a deal, you know why they bought from you versus somebody else. Mm-hmm. That's a key piece of information. Right now, you've got some competitive analysis, you've got some differentiators you can build around, and you work your way back, all the way back to the point where well, I met Ian, he responded to an email blast I did. So I know my lead source all the way through. And so if you think about the milestones of a deal, then you've got your key metrics you need to track. So really what you're doing is you're building a sales funnel, right? You're building out the stages of the sales process. And most people know that I'm a big believer in knowing the buyer's journey, how the buyer buys versus how we want to sell. So if you know that the buyer goes through these typically 4 stages, right? Discovery of the, qualifying their own need, research on who they can do work with or who can solve the problem, maybe a deep dive analysis of those solution providers, and then some final decisions. Then you align your sales process to that buying journey. And so you've got stages you can measure against. And so if you know that 50% of the leads that come into the funnel become qualified prospects because you've done good discovery and you know that there's a fit there, and then 50% of those prospects close, now you can easily do the math and figure out how many leads you need to get to your desired goal if you know your average deal size too. So think about the milestones of the process. Don't overly engineer it. normally there are no more than 4 to 6 stages of a sales process. If you're trying to track more than that, you're tracking too much detail. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
Yeah.
typically how I think about it.
Should I be tracking lead sources and opportunity and sales opportunity sources separately, or is that too? Like if I get, I met this person at the Chamber of Commerce, but they became an opportunity because of the relationship that I built with them at the Firestorm, right? I mean, is that
Yeah.
something I should be tracking separately?
Yeah, for sure. Because often what happens is you connect with them somehow, and there's a period of time that goes by before they actually engage with your brand and they become an opportunity. So I think that knowing what generates leads is important, but then knowing what generates opportunities is important too. Because something you did, something you said, converted them from an interested lead to a qualified prospect. So I think that's really important. And sometimes it's nothing you did necessarily. Something it's just their business situation changed,
Right.
but you've been marketing to them, and then they know you're available. So for sure. So I think of it in two things. Was there something I did to create that opportunity, or did something change in their business that created the opportunity? Because if that's the case, I can go find other people that are having that same challenge.
Right. Right.
Market to them.
Excellent. So we've only got a few minutes left here, like I said, I want to kind of encapsulate this and as your response to this as in the response to the exact question: how do I increase my closing ratio?
Disqualify more deals.
Excellent.
That's the truth, right? I mean, you can manipulate statistics, and you
Right.
can only count the qualified deals and close 100% of them. But that really is the case. I think it's being honest with yourself and the prospect to see if there's a good fit,
Mhm.
and be okay to say this isn't going to work, and
Mhm.
move on with something that has a higher likelihood of closing where you can add value. That's the way to close more, and follow up, follow up, follow up.
Right. Excellent. So wrapping up here, if you had one recommendation to leave the audience with to get better results, what would that be?
That's a big question, Ian. I would
We've talked
say,
about a lot of things today. So.
yeah, yeah, we have. Um, Take more time to understand the outcomes they're desiring, not the problem they're trying to solve. Right? Be the doctor. The patient comes in and said, "I've got a pain right here." They don't just give you medicine. They understand what's causing that pain, what's the problem, and it may be something completely different. And we as salespeople tend to sell to this problem that's stated by the prospect,
Mhm.
not the problem, right? It's the outcome they're trying to achieve that we want to focus on. It changes the perspective of the whole conversation and establishes you as an expert, because then you can ask, inquisitive questions about the outcomes, and not just focus on the problem, because all your competitors are selling to the stated problem. Don't be like your competitors.
Right. Excellent. Beautiful. And just to kind of wrap up completely here, again, I appreciate you joining today. I'm really excited for what's coming in the next coming months here. So just as kind of a reminder, how can people get a hold of you if they want to reach out for more information?
Yeah, just Google me, Dean Isaacs, or Vantage Group, and you can put Vantage Group Denver. I'm available on all the social platforms. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Everyone in our audience, thank you for joining us today as well. Again, you're going to see an email coming from me here in the next, probably this afternoon or maybe tomorrow morning, with an opportunity to get involved in the community table moving forward as a panelist, to be able to ask questions and get them answered live. So yeah, keep an eye out, and looking forward to next month. And as always, thank you so much. We'll see y'all soon.
Thanks. Take care.
Cheers.